As the sun began to set on a late spring day in 1974, there were two weary hikers that were struggling along the Appalachian Trail. And the air was thick with tension and exhaustion as they followed this side trail towards their campsite and their shelter. And little did they know that the next morning would bring a harrowing ordeal that would test their survival skills. And as they approached the shelter, their eyes fell upon this disheveled man who appeared out of place in this rugged wilderness. At this point, Joel Polson's heart raced as he whispered his concerns to his younger hiking partner, Margaret Hart. But despite their initial apprehension, they were drawn to the mysterious man and welcomed him into the camp. However, little did they know this encounter would lead them down a dangerous path filled with unforeseen dangers and deadly consequences. Welcome back to Mystery Files, everybody. Thank you for joining me in today, and I just wanted to let you know, if you get this video up now to 100 likes, I will be doing 2 stories a week. And why I say 100 likes is because, what do you expect me to do? I got 2 new channels coming out. We got Disturbing Upvotes, and now another new one called Upfront Endings. Upfront Endings is now where I will be telling stories and I will be giving you the conclusion, and then you will have to decide based on that conclusion if you want to watch how we got there. So make sure to find the hidden clue in today's story to be entered into the giveaway, and when you find that clue, put what it is with the timestamp into the comments to be entered. Okay, I'm ready to get into this story. It's a long walk. That's all I'll say, but as of now, let's slip into a mind that's not our own. Let's go. In 1974, Joel Polson met Margaret Hart while she was working at a restaurant. And after only a brief acquaintance, he boldly invited her to join him through this hike on the Appalachian Trail. And although Joel was a 26-year-old with a taste for adventure, he was not an experienced hiker. He had already proven his fortitude by biking from his hometown in South Carolina all the way up to Ohio. But other than that, he really had no experience. But it was his passion for exploration that had now turned him to backpacking and led him to convince 17-year-old Margaret, who he barely knew, to take on the Appalachian Trail with him. Despite being a student at the University of South Carolina and not much of a hiker herself, Margaret was drawn in by the prospect of this adventure and hoped it would provide some clarity and direction for where she wanted to go in the future. Plus, she also felt comfortable with Joel's similar mindset and trusted him as a companion on the demanding journey ahead. So, after deceiving her parents into thinking she was joining a much larger group instead of just Joel, they began their journey to the trail together. And on their first day of hiking, Joel and Margaret got a very late start and only covered a few miles in the dark. Then, the next morning, they woke up to the reality of how challenging the Appalachian Trail was going to be. And they were carrying these heavy packs with Margaret already developing blisters by lunchtime. But despite these difficulties, they pushed through. And then they stopped to talk with some of the workers that were actually doing maintenance. And by late afternoon, they reached Low Gap Shelter and decided to, call it a day after only hiking about 6 miles. But it wasn't just them at the shelter. There was also another person that was already there, and his name was Ralph, and he welcomed them in. Although Margaret didn't think much of him, Joel couldn't shake off a strange feeling about Ralph, that he seemed out of place and not like all the other hikers. So, when they went down to the water source, Joel expressed his concerns to Margaret about Ralph, possibly, stealing their gear or something else nefarious. So they both sprinted back to the campsite at that moment. Luckily, They found everything untouched when they returned to the shelter. They kept their distance from Ralph for the rest of the night, but as time passed, Joel found himself slowly but surely warming up to him. So as Joel was finally starting to warm up, both figuratively and literally, one of the things that turned his opinion around was Ralph's willingness to go out and venture out into the wilderness for firewood, a challenging task after a long day of hiking. Joel even somewhat admitted to Margaret that, I guess he's not that bad after all. Although some doubt in his mind still lingered, and he insisted still on them leaving their shelter early the next morning. So he had already packed up all of their belongings in the morning, and by the time that Margaret woke up, they were eager to get back on the trail, and Joel kind of had this sense of urgency in his demeanor. So Margaret frantically gathered her supplies as Joel made his way down to this nearby stream. And she, watched him splash water on his face before turning to make his way back. A peaceful moment shattered by this sudden violence. You see, Joel wanted to get an early move on and leave because even though he said he was warming up to Ralph, he was really still uncertain of this stranger that had been sharing a campsite with them. And at that moment, Joel was washing up by the stream to get ready to leave. That's also when Ralph woke up, and Ralph immediately left the tent and Margaret behind. And then Margaret at the time probably thought, he was just going to the bathroom or to clean up as well. But that wasn't the case. Ralph indeed was a criminal, and he wanted all the stuff that Joel had. But Ralph was intimidated by Joel's demeanor, so he didn't think he could win a straight-up one-on-one fight. And Ralph, being the criminal that he was, had other plans on how to even out this fight. Okay, so Ralph, who had been lurking in the shadows near the shelter, sprang out and attacked Joel with brutal force. And as Margaret was still lacing up her boots, she heard a deafening gun blast and saw Joel crumple to the ground. And it was clear that Ralph had ambushed him, leaving Margaret helpless as he tied her up and dragged her away from safety. Her heart raced with terror as she struggled against her restraints, wondering what sadistic plans Ralph had in store for her. And he taunted her with his lack of a plan, fueled only by this pure evil intent. So after an agonizing 15 minutes, Ralph returned and callously revealed that he had killed Joel, making him the first murder victim on the Appalachian Trail. And tears just streamed down Margaret's face as she begged for answers about Joel's fate, but Ralph only said, "I want to get rid of him." And uncertain of his next move, Ralph rummaged through Joel's belongings in search of money. Then for a second time, he forcefully led Margaret back into the thick woods and tied her up once again. But he assured her that he wouldn't kill her, and instead insisted leaving her bound with provisions and a note at a nearby shelter stating her location. Perhaps he hoped someone would find her. After carrying out his plan, he walked away as he had done before now, but this time, just 15 minutes later, he returned again. Margaret was convinced he was finally going to end her life, but Ralph surprised her with a confession instead. And that confession was that he revealed that he killed Joel in order to take his gear. Joel was too strong for Ralph to simply overpower and steal from. And additionally, Ralph couldn't bring himself to leave Margaret alone and vulnerable in the woods, knowing she could potentially die if no one found her. So in a strange and twisted compassion, he admitted that he didn't want to kill her and claimed that he had never killed a woman before. Despite Margaret being the only witness to Joel's murder and potentially able to accuse Ralph, he took pity on her in the woods instead. And despite being a psychopathic killer, Ralph didn't harm Margaret and instead gave her a choice. You can stay tied up, or you can hike with me to the next highway where I'll let you go. Margaret then mulled it over for a second, and she chose to go for the hike, with Ralph, a murderer, guiding her from behind. I mean, at that moment, it's kind of a tough decision. Do I stay stuck out here where animals could get to me and I could die, or do I take the chance with him? She decided to take the chance with him. So, at the beginning of their trek, Ralph cautioned Margaret not to tell anyone else about their journey, threatening to harm her and any other hikers if she did. This only added to Margaret's fear and doubt about making it out alive. However, despite his initial threats, Ralph showed a twisted sense of compassion by ensuring that Margaret was comfortable on their hike. In fact, Margaret even praised him for being unbelievably kind and making sure she had enough food and rest during their descent. But their teamwork would soon be tested as they encountered trail workers along the way. And as soon as they saw the workers, Margaret's fear just gripped her. She recognized one of them from the previous day when she and Joel had stopped to chat. She was afraid that if he recognized her and figured out that something was wrong, she would die. But luckily, this worker didn't seem to notice or care that she was now hiking with a different man. Maybe it was because, Ralph had Joel's backpack on, or maybe the worker just wasn't very observant. Either way, they all went their separate ways without incident. And during their conversation, Ralph and Margaret learned some valuable information from the workers. Apparently, the next road crossing north was much further than they originally thought. And this made Margaret anxious, knowing that she would likely have to spend at least one night in the woods with Ralph. Despite him not having hurt her yet, and actually being quite nice so far, she couldn't shake off her fears after a long day of hiking. And as they continued on their journey, they passed the time by talking about books and music like any two strangers would. Eventually, Margaret took the opportunity to ask Ralph about his past. But what he revealed is probably not what Margaret hoped for. He revealed that he was from up north and actually felt more at home in the wilderness of the western United States rather than the Appalachian Mountains. And he also admitted that he had spent time in jail and was currently on the run from the FBI. So eventually, they reached Rocky Knob Shelter, where they took a break to consult their maps and realized that the information given to them by the workers was actually incorrect. They were actually less than 3 miles away from the next road crossing, and if they hurried, they could possibly reach it before nightfall. This was a relief for Margaret because she would no longer have to spend the night in the woods with Joel's murderer. However, her relief was short-lived, as Ralph announced that he wouldn't be releasing her at the road crossing, but instead would let her go after that. Eventually, they reached Unco Gap, where they found the road. Ralph made it clear to Margaret that if she spoke of being held against her will or mentioned Joel's name in any way, everyone around them would be shot and killed. So at that point, they both just stuck out their thumbs and managed to hitch a ride into the town of Helene, Georgia. Ralph had stolen Joel's money and traveler's checks, which they used to check into the Chattahoochee motel under fake names. And at this point, Margaret was terrified, knowing she would be stuck with this man for who knows how long. But instead of harming her, Ralph turned on the TV to see if Joel's death had made the news yet. And luckily, it didn't. So, feeling temporarily safe, they ate some food and Margaret took a shower while Ralph kept a close eye on her. Surprisingly, he didn't touch her or make any advances towards her. Instead, he told her strange things like how he almost gave her the gun during their hike earlier so she'd know that he wouldn't harm her. Their conversation was just as bizarre as before. Ralph had a personal connection to folk singer Arlo Guthrie, and he even shared that quote with her. And he expressed his regret for not being able to meet Margaret under different circumstances and said that if he wasn't caught up in all of this, he could really like her. Has anybody ever heard so far of something like this where the kidnapper falls for the victim? Well, either way, the tone of the conversation took a darker turn when Margaret asked Ralph if he had ever taken somebody's life before. And his response was yes. But he tried to justify it by claiming it was self-defense or during a fight. Margaret may have not felt any comfort from this explanation, but she still managed to fall asleep that night and slept well until the morning. So, after packing up their belongings, Ralph and Margaret stopped for a cup of coffee. And despite his previous insistence, Ralph couldn't bring himself to let Margaret hitchhike back to her home in Columbia, South Carolina, because he had now grown feelings from her. And it was another example of his twisted sense of compassion. He believed it was way too dangerous for Margaret to go out there and travel alone. Instead, they decided to go to a bus station where they could each purchase separate tickets for their journeys. And at that point, they managed to hitch a ride to Cleveland, Georgia, and eventually arrived at the station. This was the first time since Ralph had shot Joel that Margaret felt she might actually make it home alive. And she walked up to the ticket counter and requested a ticket to Columbia, only to be told that there were no direct routes available. And once again, Margaret found herself trapped with Ralph as they hitched another ride to a different bus station. But this time, the route was available, and after purchasing their respective tickets, they still had some time before their departures. During this period, Ralph took the opportunity to walk that line between empathy and threats once more. He actually acknowledged that Margaret would most likely go and tell the police about what happened, but he still allowed her to go free. However, he warned her that if she went immediately to the police and they were waiting for him as he arrived in Atlanta, innocent people would die as a result of her actions. And with Ralph's warning still ringing in her ears, Margaret watched as his bus pulled away and he disappeared into the distance away from her sight. And at this point, physically unharmed, she was now free from his captivity. But fear still gripped her tightly. He had warned her not to call the police right away, and she actually followed his instructions as best as she could. So she boarded a bus to Columbia and arrived late that night. And her first attempt at reaching out for help was calling her brother, but he did not answer. So she tried another friend, but with the same result. At this point, desperate for somebody just to turn to, she dialed her parents' number, only to be met with silence once again. So finally, she called the police and requested someone to come and pick her up. Can't say the girl didn't try. And at this moment, she informed authorities that she had witnessed a murder in Georgia and needed to report it. So an investigation was launched, and on May 11th, 1974, they found the body of Joe Paulson near Low Gap Shelter. Then, a few days later, a random woman in Atlanta contacted the police and identified a man who matched the description of the Appalachian Trail killer. She had read about the crime in the newspaper. His name was Ralph Howard Fox, age 31. And he was apprehended at gunpoint on May 16th, 1974. And as Margaret had discovered from him, he indeed did have a long criminal record for charges such as kidnapping, auto theft, burglary, and much more. So he was convicted of the murder and sentenced to life in prison, but shockingly managed to gain parole in 1991. And as expected, Ralph Fox went on to brutally kill another victim, this time in Michigan, and this time it was a woman. You can only imagine that he regretted letting Margaret go since it became his downfall, and he probably took all his anger out on some innocent woman because of what he thought was betrayal from another, even though it really wasn't betrayal because Margaret wasn't the one to call and identify him. And by the end of 1992, he was back behind bars, thankfully, once again. Fortunately, he remained incarcerated until his death in 2003. It was an egregious failure of justice to release him on parole initially. And as for Margaret Hart, she continued her education and earned her doctorate degree before embarking on a very successful career with the U.S. Agency for International Development. But justice was not served when Ralph Fox, sentenced to life in prison, was released on parole. The lesson here is to trust your instincts. While this story is scary, millions hike the Appalachian Trail without incident each year. That just goes to show if it can happen, it will happen, regardless of how rare you may think it is. And if someone makes you uncomfortable, listen to your gut and leave. Do not spend the night with uneasy feelings. Okay guys, that's the story for today. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments. Also, let's get those likes up. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my 2 new channels that are in the description. I just put them in there. And make sure if you haven't become a member yet to become a member, either with YouTube Join or with Patreon, both in the description as well. And also check out my merch that's right below comments. I'll see you guys next time. Peace.